I'll check. I haven't heard, but I'll find out. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
We're getting there. We're almost there.
Really? Good. Any more to pass out?
Joe, he's got them all.
Tough guy. Let him work. Where are we today?
The very end of the chapter, of the portion.
Deuteronomy and then,
No, we're in Genesis.
yeah. Genesis.
Chapter 6.
Oh, okay.
6:1. We're back to the beginning.
Yeah. This is, not that. That's yours. Who's the young lady with you? You will?
Yes, test. Test. 1, 2. Test. 1, 2. Shabbat Shalom at home. Hope you can hear me.
Nice to see you. Welcome. I'm Bill.
Okay, here we go. Shabbat Shalom. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי 6 ימים עשה אדוני עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם וביום השביעי שבת וינפש שבת וינפש שבת וינפש ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא בריאה גופן אמן. לחיים. Refreshing. It's refreshing. Okay, blessing for Torah Study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, good Shabbos, everyone. We are now starting Triennial Cycle 3. We finished 2, and since there are 3, after 2 you go to 3, and then 3 go to 1. So we're now studying the third of each of the Torah portions for this year, beginning, of course, with Bereshit, which is Genesis, the first Torah portion in the Torah. Now, you probably came here thinking today, if there's one Torah portion I know, it's this one. I mean, this guy doesn't have anything about Bereshit that I don't know. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Because we're going to learn something that I never knew. Maybe you knew it. But well, it's not that I didn't know it. It's just I never realized it, never put it together in this way. And when you do, it's very exciting. So we're going to look today at Genesis chapter 6. Okay? Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. Now, we could read through Genesis 5, but that's the section of the begats. You know what the begats are? Okay, so this guy had a son, then this guy had a son. Every once in a while, someone has a daughter. You only know what you know from the verses. So I don't really know what to do with the years. Well, it's chapter 6, Genesis 6. Does anyone have the page in plow? 50, what? 52. Actually, in my book, it's 54. It's going to start to change more, but if you're using the Saperstein. So, when it says that Noah lived, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and these other people lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, the documents that we found from the hospital, from those and the death certificates, they've been damaged. And it's hard to make out the exact dates. So we don't know exactly if that's how long they lived. Like, they found some of the birth certificates. They dug up some of the birth certificates, but they were damaged. All right. There were no birth certificates. Okay, whatever. This is it. The Torah. This is the birth certificate. So Adam has a bunch of kids. The first one is named Seth, which I always thought was interesting because my middle name is Adam and my brother's middle name is Seth. But I don't think there was anything, I think it's just a coincidence. And the days of Adam, at the time that Seth was born, he was 800 years old. So, I don't know. I don't know what that means. Maybe it was 800 years. I don't know. I don't think anybody does. And then Adam was 930 when he dies. Could it have been that the original text said he died on September 30th? Right? Maybe that was the 9. Or maybe the medical examiner said he died at 9:30 a.m. and then it got I don't know. Okay, so then he lives longer. Seth lives, and when he's 807 years old, then there's this guy Enosh, and so forth and so forth. And sometimes it tells us that someone had sons and daughters, and sometimes it tells us what their names were. So if they just tell us that he had sons, if the Torah just tells us that so-and-so had sons and daughters without the names, but later on it tells us this person had son and that person, here's what that name is, then probably the person where we get the name was more significant for whatever reason in that day. It was a significant person. We don't necessarily know exactly why, but if the Torah gives the name as opposed to saying he begot sons and daughters, then having that name, there must have been a reason. I don't think we know what those reasons were, but it does point out that some people were more significant than others. Right. Okay, so that's all I'm saying. There may be, there are people who will be remembered forever for the good and the bad, right? We remember Haman. We're supposed to blot out his name and never say his name, but we say his name all the time. Right? We remember horrible people. We remember great people, like Martin Luther King, right? There may be some great people who die, this year that history totally forgets because whatever. They just, you can't remember everybody. So, I don't know. There's something about these people. All right, and that's everything that happens in chapter 5. And then we get to chapter 6. And once we figure out who all these people are, the last person that we find out about, if you look at the very end of chapter 5, is someone who becomes significant. And his name is Noah, right? So you know why Noah is significant. Noah, well, we'll get to it. Okay, so that's what we have so far. That there's something significant about him, and then we learn his kids' names, and they're also very significant. And now we're up to chapter 6. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 1. Okay, no, Norman, right into the mic.
Now as the people began to multiply on the earth, daughters were born to them. And when the divine beings saw how fair were the human women, they took wives for themselves as they chose.
Okay, now this could be the most bizarre verse in the entire Torah. Right? I mean, huh? Okay, let's read that again, because this is really weird stuff. Okay, chapter 6, verse 1. Let's start one more time. Let's try to pick out clues here.
Now, as people began to multiply on the earth, daughters were born to them. And when the divine beings saw how fair were the human women, they took wives for themselves as they chose. Then the Eternal One said, "My spirit will not forever endure the humans, as they are but fallible flesh. Their lifespan shall be only 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and afterwards too, when the divine beings mated with the human women, they bore for them the heroes who from of old enjoyed great renown." Okay.
Let's just, would you mind finishing through verse 8?
When the Eternal saw how great was the wickedness of human beings in the earth, that the direction of their thoughts was nothing but wicked all the time, the Eternal regretted having made human beings on earth and was heartsick. So thought the Eternal, "I will wipe the humans whom I created off the face of the earth, the humans, and with them the beasts, the reptiles, the birds of the sky, for I rue the day that I made them." But that Noah found favor in the Eternal's sight.
Okay. Now, the word Noach and the word favor are like a Rorschach. What's it called? So Noach is Nun Chet, and the word for favor is Chet Nun. It's Noach backwards. So like mirror each other, right? So a palindrome. Okay, so Noach means comfort. You know the word Menachem?
Yes.
Right, Menachem. And right, Menachem Begin. Some other famous Menachems. Menachem Mendel Schneerson, right, the Rebbe. Right, Menachem means to comfort. Noah comes from that root, which actually there's a whole question. Well, why wasn't his name then Menachem? Noah is a short version of that. And Chen is the beginning of Hanukkah, actually. Chen means favor or comfort. Sort of like, not comfort, but like appreciation. And that's what it says, V'noach matzachen. Noach, something about him brought comfort to God. Okay, now, the story starts off weird and ends terrible, right? So, can anyone tell me, let's first look at what we understand and then try to decipher what we don't understand. Okay, now when I say what we understand, there are some things that are pretty clear. People got married, and seemingly from different types of people, and it turned out really bad. First of all, did you notice, I started off by talking about we don't know what to do with the years of why these people lived so long. But what I do know is why we don't live that long anymore. You know, cholesterol. Why we don't live so long anymore is because of verse 3. Right? What is verse 3? My spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man because he is flesh. Besides, his days shall be 120 years. And from that point forward, no one would live past 120 years. And as far as we know, they haven't. And even when Moses got, the only person who was deserving of living past 120 years was Moses. And even God cut it short for him. Right? You know, at the end of the Torah we read, his vigor was unabated. He could have gone on. But God said, okay, look, you reached 120. That's it. And even when he reached 120, and Moses could have still lived on, you know, his knees were not shot. Even after all that schlepping around in the wilderness, his sciatica was intact, which is more than I can say for myself. But God said, you have to die, because I made a deal back in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, that nobody's going to live past 120. That includes you. Right? Okay, so that's one thing we understand. Another thing we understand is there's no Jews yet. Right? We haven't gotten to the concept of the Hebrew, Abraham. The Hebrew, which becomes the Israelite, which becomes the Jew. But that doesn't exist yet. This is pre that. Okay? So, whatever happens, if you look in verse 4, there are these people called the Nephilim. And they would consort with the daughters of man. Now, I don't know what that means yet. We're going to figure that out. But what I do know is it turned out really badly. Because in verse 5, it says God saw the wickedness and how bad everything was. And it was so bad that he's going to have to destroy everything. But there's one guy that we met at the end of the last chapter named Noah who was okay with God, and that's foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the next chapter, that Noah's going to save everybody and everyone else is going to die because of this evil that's going on in the world right now. Okay, so that's what we understand. And there should be a lot of what we don't understand. Now, the first clue is, who are these people? Nephilim. Right? I don't know if you have that translation. A good the first word in verse 4 is ha-nephilim. Now, you all know Ashrei, right? Ashrei, Yoshvei, Veit. You know it's an acrostic? You know we have every letter of the alphabet except one? What's the one letter that it excludes? The nun. Why? Right. There's no nun. So we go, Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha, Od Yalucha, so it starts with an aleph. So the next one has to start with a bet. Right? And etc. B'chol yom avarcheka, gadol d'naim lameod. Right? Dor l'dor yishol. Right? But when you get to the nun, there's no nun. But in the line before that, there's a word that starts with a nun called noflim. And noflim means the fallen ones. So when he wrote the acrostic, the author took out nun as if to say, I'm leaving the nun out to remember all those who have passed away, the fallen. The word nofel in Hebrew means to fall. Linpol is the infinitive, to fall. Nofel, someone who falls. Even in modern Hebrew, nofel means to fall. Okay? So, Nephilim means the fallen ones. Now, it's often translated as the giants, or sometimes even the divine beings. I'm not sure exactly what that means yet, but it's a very problematic phrase that is sometimes translated in different ways. So let's just review the different ways. One is that Nephilim, they were the fallen ones. Well, if they fell from somewhere, maybe they fell from the heavens. And so that maybe means there's some sort of angelic nature to them. Maybe, and then you have this term, the fallen angel, which also in the 80s was a song by the band Poison. If you remember, they had a song called Fallen Angel. That's when I grew up. All right. It was a pretty good song back in the day. Now, Nephilim, fallen doesn't sound positive. It may be that they're bad for some other reason. And we find out that they're bad because God gives them all the death penalty because of how evil they become. Also, they're not the most chivalrous individuals. In verse 2, they see the women, and they don't invite them on romantic dates. They just take them. Right? So these, if you're going to call them angels, geez. Okay, so maybe they're fallen angels. Maybe they were angels, but they couldn't cut it in angel school, and they fell, and then they ruined everything here. And they did. They ruined the whole world to the point that God had to destroy it and start over with Noah and his family. In Christianity. In Judaism, Satan means an angel who contends with God, which is actually the first source on the sheet. Where do we have Satan in the Bible? Satan, the Hebrew word is Satan, right? But Satan in Hebrew and in Jewish tradition doesn't mean the devil. It means the adversary. So if you would read the book of Job in English, and it says there's this force that contends with God, the Hebrew is Satan, the English is this adversary. Now, Christian tradition took it a little bit differently, added a tail and a pitchfork and a good suntan. We don't have that. We don't know exactly what he looks like. So there is no devil in Judaism, but there is Satan, who is an angel who annoys God. Right, okay? And that's if you read the book of Job, what does he do? He says, yeah, this guy Job, he's great, but I bet if you took his house away, he'd hate you. And I bet if you made him sick, he'd hate you. And I bet if you killed his family, he'd hate you. That's Satan. And where does it come from? Job. So, right on cue. Sorry, Joe. Oh, okay. That's the third source. You guys are killing me. All right. Yeah. So that's where that. I can answer your question now, but for Joe's question, I need about 26 more minutes because I want to fill the whole hour. All right. But if you look at source 1. All right. So by the way, here's what you do. If you don't know what this kind of being is, if you don't know what these fallen angel or divine spirits are from looking at Genesis, what's the first thing you should do? Look at other places in the Bible where that word is used and see if you can draw anything from the context. So, there are a couple other places where we see the term. Sort of. Yeah, sort of. Yes, but I don't. That's the numbers reference that I have in the third source. But we're going in that direction. Okay, if you look at Job, chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "One day the divine beings presented themselves before God, and the adversary came along with them." So, there were these divine beings, these Nephilim type people, and they existed in heaven. So you might now say, if you're going to translate something as, and there are a couple different ways to do it. You could say Nephilim, but you could also say B'nai Elim. So if you're going to say there are these B'nai Elim, or B'nai Elokim, if you're going to say that, you can say, okay, such a thing as divine beings existed. And, we know for sure that they're angels, right? We know that we see clearly in the Torah. I'm not talking about Midrash, I'm talking about the Torah. Remember, Jacob wrestled with an angel. 3 angels came and Abraham welcomed him into the tent. 2 angels went and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. We see angels. When Balaam's riding on the donkey, an angel comes before him and says, "Had you come further, I would have killed you." Those are references in the Torah. There are plenty of it. Now, do they mean actual angels? I don't know, but that's what the Torah says. The Torah says these are angels. We have the angel of death that comes and kills, the 10th plague, that comes and kills. Right? Malach HaMavet. Right? So we have angels. Is it possible that some of them wore out their welcome in heaven and came down here? Maybe. But what Job points out is, this verse, is that there are such a group of people who exist, and maybe that's what we're talking about. Now, Genesis, again, you can see how lazy I've been getting. I just, you see how long that is? Who's got time to translate all that? That would have taken me another 3.5 minutes, and who needs it? Who needs it? It actually probably took me longer to cut and paste it without copying God's name. That took about 45 minutes. To translate it would have just taken, it's like if you've ever been in a restaurant and, they don't write down what you order anymore. They either memorize it and then you don't get what you ordered, or they put it into their iPad. But the iPad's never working. And, so you want to order. It's like, I'll have the fish. So one time I was in a really, like a good mood. I said, you could write it down. That would screw up the whole kitchen. All right. So now it takes an hour and a half to order. All right, so Genesis Rabbah 26. By the way, this is the kind of insight you're not going to get in Boca or Del Rey. Right? This is the kind of insight you're not going to get. All right. Vayiru b'nei so this is what the Midrash says. Vayiru b'nei Elokim, and the divine beings saw, v'gomer, etc. So that's a verse in the Torah that the Midrash is commentating. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who is the same as Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who is the guy who invented Kabbalah, the guy who hid in the cave. Kare lahon b'nei dine. Now this will sound weird because it's in Aramaic. But karu lahon means he called them. He's telling you that b'nei Elokim, who are these people? B'nei dine. You know the word din? Well, they were judges. These were the judges. Now, back then, if you were a judge, you were in control. It was almost like the princes, the kings. They were in control. And the people who were powerful took any woman they wanted. That's basically what it's saying. But what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's perspective is that these are powerful individuals who became corrupted, as opposed to anything divine about them. Okay, that's his opinion. And then he goes on and says, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai mekalel lechol min dekare lohon b'nei Elohe, which means Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai would curse anyone who called them divine beings, as if they were angels. Now, why such strong language? This is what you call a sectarian midrash. It means there was a difference of opinion between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Pharisees are the people who became the rabbis. And it was their belief from the midrashic material that these people were just people. Powerful people, but human beings. Whereas there may have been some sort of Sadducean belief. You know, Sadducees sort of were the priestly class that when the second temple was destroyed, they ceased to exist, but they had differences of opinion. And the main difference of opinion between the Sadducees and the Pharisees were the Sadducees didn't accept the oral law. So look what happens. If you don't accept the oral law, right, which is today the Talmud and the Midrash. But if you don't accept the oral law and you look at the Torah and the Torah says, B'nai Elokim, divine beings, you say, these are angels. Because that's what the Torah says. But Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, representing the rabbis of the Talmud, says, we never go by what the Torah says. You have to take the Talmud. The Talmud and the Midrash explain that's never what that means. What are you going to do? Go take someone's eye out who took your eye out? It says an eye for an eye. We never do that. Right? So you could go with whichever one you believe, but the Pharisaic tradition won out. The Sadducees don't exist anymore. The Pharisees became the rabbis of the Talmud, and Judaism was defined by them. So if you go by that logic, the way we hold today is that, no, these were not angels. These were just people who were very powerful. Now, what's a powerful person? Remember when I told you when we read the begats, sometimes you get the names of people and sometimes you don't? Right? Because it was already starting to hint that there are people in the world who become more significant and more powerful. And the Torah tells us their names. Right? And there are other people who you don't know their names and they're not as significant and maybe they get taken advantage of by the people who have power. That never happens anymore. You never see that. You never see that anymore. There's no corruption, anymore. But okay, so the first thing that I'm saying is that one of the ideas is that these angels. You could say, you know what? Look, I think they're fallen angels. Okay, fine. You could say that. I don't know that they're not. And the reason why people say that is because the word naflim means that they fell from somewhere. But what it could mean is they fell from moral behavior. And you don't have to be an angel becoming a person to go from someone who should be behaving well to someone who isn't behaving well. So it doesn't matter. But it appears like, and at least the rabbis, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is telling you, the rabbinic tradition was always that, no, these are people who were corrupted by their power. Now, the Anakite situation is very interesting, which I want to get to, but not until the end because that's going to bring it home. What I first want to ask is the same question that the rabbis asked, specifically Rashi. Rashi starts his commentary on the Torah by asking, what do I need this story for? Who cares? The Torah was meant to be a book to tell us how to behave. And in order to know how to behave, you have to know the mitzvahs. And there's 613 mitzvahs. Genesis only has 3 of them. The other 610 are in Exodus through Deuteronomy. The 3 that are in Genesis are, the first one, be fruitful and multiply. The second one, circumcision. And the third one, don't eat the nerve, like the sciatic nerve that's removed from the animal, because that's where, when Jacob was wrestling with the angel, that's where he had that issue. And to this day, one of the main things that a kosher butcher does is removes that nerve. The person who does that is called the menaker. Menaker means to uproot the nerve, which is ironic. Menaker because when I first learned, in English it's Menaker, but in Hebrew you pronounce it Menaker. When I got to Charlotte and I had just learned this material about the Menaker, I had a dentist whose name was Menaker. And he was removing, and I thought, I walked in, I'm like, do you even know this? Okay, he didn't. So Rashi asked the question, if the Torah is meant to teach us about moral behavior, spiritual behavior, how to go about your lives, teach us about Shabbat, teach us about Rosh Chodesh, teach us about the holidays, teach us about charity, teach us everything we need to know how to be Jews. And later on, if you want to tell us stories about, fruit and fig leaves and, arcs and stuff, that's fine. But really, what do we need it for? Okay, so Rashi and his grandson Rashbam, have answers to this question. But you have to have the answer to this question in order to be able to understand where we're going to go with the Nephilim. Okay, so if you look at the bottom, we're going to skip to, before we skip to the bottom of the sheet, the second to the last sheet is 1 Samuel 28:13. So besides Job, and besides the Anakites, which we'll get to, there's one other mention of someone who is like a holy being. And that comes in 1 Samuel 28:13, probably a verse you had at the tip of your tongue. The king here is Saul. And Saul is communing with like some sort of witch. Like some sort of, it's the witch of Endor. And he's, she's like, what's the word? I'm blanking on the word. Someone you go to in the Torah. Like a seer, yeah, there's another. Oh, an oracle, perfect. It's like going to an oracle, like Larry Ellison. Okay, so, all right. The king answered her, "Don't be afraid, what do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up from the earth." Now, this oracle is telling Saul what Hannah said. I'm sorry, not Hannah. Hannah's the mother, but this woman saw a divine being coming up from the earth. That divine being is referring to Samuel, Shmuel. He was not an angel; he was a regular guy. We know his mother. His mother was Hannah, right? So we know that story. But he's referred to as a divine being because there was something special about him. He ended up being a Nazirite and so forth. But my point is that you could very well be referred to as a divine being and actually just be a human. And so because of this verse, it's possible for us to look at the Nephilim in chapter 6 of Genesis and say, it doesn't mean angels. It just means powerful people who fell somehow in their behavior. Okay, so, that's some evidence, if you want, you could take from Samuel if you wanted to follow that line of defense, which is exactly the line of defense that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the rabbis of the Talmud take. Okay, now, who else? Ed, would you mind reading Rashi on Genesis 1:1? So what I just want to do for a second now is to look at Rashi and then Rashbam on the back of the page and see their answers as to why the Torah starts off with the book of creation and these other stories as opposed to the stories of the mitzvahs. Now, I'm promising you now, what Rashi says you're going to find the most far-fetched thing in the world. The fact that he said this 1,000 years ago shows he had no idea what was going to happen. He was completely off. You're not going to believe how wrong he was. Watch this.
Okay. In the beginning, Rabbi Isaac said, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with Exodus 12:2. This month shall be unto you the first of the months.
Right. Teach us from day one how we're supposed to live. Teach us what Rosh Chodesh is. Teach us what Rosh Hashanah is. Teach us what we're supposed to do. That's how it should have started, and it didn't, and here's the reason. Okay?
What is the reason, then, that it commences with the account of the creation?
Again, I don't think this could ever happen, what he's saying.
Yeah, completely off base, but here it is. Because of the thought expressed in the text, Psalms 1:1-1:6, he declared to his people the strength of his works. That is, he gave an account of the work of creation in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations.
All right, so his point is here that God starts the Torah with the creation of the world to show that the world belongs, God created the world belongs to God, and God can do with it whatever he wants. That's his point so far. Okay. Now, and this, again, I don't, Rashi, way off base. This could never have happened. This would never happen, okay?
Yeah. For should the peoples of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took by force the lands of the
Right, no
seven-"
one would ever say this land doesn't properly belong to you. This could never happen.
Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One. Blessed be he. He created it and gave it to whom he pleased. When he willed, he gave it to them, and when he willed, he took it from them and gave it to us.
Okay. You see that? Rashi, pretty smart guy. Rashi, could you imagine Rashi starting his teaching? You know, what Rashi is, Rashi didn't sit and write down his commentary to the Torah. He used to teach classes, and his students would write down the most important things he said about each verse, and that got put together. But I'm sure when he taught this class, he's sitting around with some students. He said, listen, there's 7 nations who were there before the Jews came, and the Jews evicted them and took the land. And he said, this is probably really far-fetched, and, you know, I don't think this will ever happen, but someday, you know, look, he's living in France where the Jews are a persecuted minority. There's no Herzl. There's no Jabotinsky. There's no, you know, what are we going back to? Someday maybe we'll go back, but when we do, and God leads us back, and there's this miracle and we go back, there may be these other people who say, wait a minute, this isn't your land, you left. You know? So, maybe God thought of that already and said, I better start the Torah by saying I can give the land to whoever I want. That's Rashi's point of view. You can take it or leave it, but that's what he says, and it happens. If you don't believe it happens, spend a day reading my hate mail online, and you can and you will see that it happens. All right, now that's one reason. It doesn't really help us. I just think it's funny, so I brought it. But there's another. I mean, it's interesting, and you should know it. But that's a whole different class. We've talked about that though. The threshold for the land, right? It's not the other nations didn't get kicked out because the Jews showed up. The other nations got kicked out because they had sinned to the point that the land couldn't hold them anymore. Which is why when Abraham comes, God says to Abraham, I can't give you the land. And the Torah says the Canaanite were then in the land. Right? There's that famous verse, the Canaanite were then in the land, which means that the Canaanites were there, and I can't give you, Abraham, the land because they don't deserve to be kicked out yet. So I can't. And by the way, God also said to the Jews, you have the same threshold. If you sin, I'm going to kick you out too, which is why we got kicked out twice. Right? Okay, so, you know, the only difference is that we're allowed to have a Zionist movement. We're meant to come back. And God said right away when you got kicked out, remember we read this at the end of the Torah, you're going to get kicked out. God predicts you're going to get kicked out, but you're going to come back. Whereas the Perizzites and the Hittites never had Herzl. Right? There was no Perizzite. There's Shimon Peres, but he wasn't a Perizzite. Yeah, so the question is that why the Jews ended up in Egypt? Yes, there's a lot going on there. I mean, they shouldn't have ended up in Egypt. Right? First of all, Abraham never should have went down to Egypt in the first place when there was a famine. And he did. And he was punished. And the punishment was that Sarah was abducted by Pharaoh. And then when Isaac is going to go down for a famine, God says to Isaac, don't make the same mistake by going down to Egypt. And then Joseph doesn't want to go, but he's forced into slavery. But once he becomes second in command, he could go back. And he doesn't. And the other brothers could go back. The famine's over, but they don't. And that leads to problems. Okay. All right, now look what the Rashbam says. This is a different opinion on why the Torah begins with creation. By the way, we haven't gotten any of the good stuff yet, but we need all of, it's going to get really cool, but you got to know this stuff first. So, okay, Genya, would you mind reading the Rashbam? This is the first source on the back of the sheet.
There are many such examples. Our entire paragraph here was written by Moses in order for us to understand what is written in the Ten Commandments concerning the reason why the Sabbath is holy, i.e., that it is a symbol reminding us of the fact that God created the universe in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. If anyone were to think that the universe as such had already existed then in the format that we see it now, the Torah corrects such thinking.
Okay, so Shabbat is so important that the whole Torah has to be set up for Shabbat, because that's how important Shabbat is. So if the Jews got to Mount Sinai, or anyone reading the Torah starts at Mount Sinai, and you didn't know the beginning of Genesis, and you hear God rested on the seventh day, but you don't know the story, you'd say, what? What do you mean rested? What does he do all day? I mean, he's so busy. You know, why is he so busy? What do you mean he rested? I don't understand. And if you didn't have, according to the Rashbam, if you didn't have the story of what creation was and how it worked and all the explanations and the exact method to the methodology, the method to the madness of why God created, what he created on which day, and so forth, and then on the seventh day he rested, if you didn't understand that, you could never understand Shabbat. And if you couldn't understand Shabbat, when the Jews got to Mount Sinai and were commanded to Shabbat, and they didn't keep Shabbat, then all of Judaism would fall apart. Because Judaism is based on the concept of Shabbat. Okay? So Rashbam says the rest of the Torah wouldn't really make sense if you didn't have these stories of how God created the world. Okay, that's his view. You can take it or leave it, but that's his view. All right, now I want to get back to what I think is really, really very interesting. We had before another mention of what are Nephilim, or what are divine beings. And another term for that is Anakites, which is used interchangeably with divine beings. And the Anakites mean giants. Anak in Hebrew means huge, right? Right? Usually, where do you mostly see Anak in Hebrew? When there's a sale. It's always Anak. It's Anak. Everything's Anak. And you know how they say clearance? Like a clearance sale in Hebrew is the most unbelievable Hebrew word. Because clearance means chisul. But it's also the same word for killing a terrorist. You've eliminated, that they say chisul. So I remember when I first learned that word, chisul. And then I would start seeing it on storefronts. And I thought, something terrible, don't go in this store, something terrible happened here, this is where they got Abu, whatever. And no, it's just a clearance. It's just a clearance. So, it's a true story. All right, now, what is the context by which we see giants in the book of Numbers? The story of the spies. So the story of the spies is Shalach Lecha, my Torah portion, my bar mitzvah portion. They send in the spies. They say the land's great, but the people living there are enormous. We look like grasshoppers in their eyes, and they would destroy us if we would go to war with them, and then that's what leads to the 40 years of wandering. Okay. Caleb and Joshua were the two good ones, right? But the people listened to the other 10, and that's why they were punished. They didn't listen to Caleb and Joshua. And Caleb and Joshua did go into the land of Israel, but the rest of them died out in the wilderness, and except for the Levites, and then only their kids would go in. So if you look at Numbers 13:33, we have this word, Nephilim, the fallen ones. We saw the Nephilim there. The Anakites are part of the Nephilim. We look like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. Now, Rashi there says, Anakim, who are descendants of Shem, Chazai, and Azael, who fell from the heaven in the generation of Enosh. So when it says fell from heaven, what he's really saying is Enosh was the grandson of Adam. And these are human beings. We saw this guy begot this guy, and this guy begot this guy. But in that time period, some of them became corrupted and became terrible. And what happened was, those people who were the Nephilim, they mixed with, they were supposed to be holy, and they took women that they weren't supposed to, and they mixed, and they produced a generation that deserved to be destroyed, and they were in the flood. Here also are the Nephilim. Now, these are the Nephilim who are part of the 7 nations who live in Israel, who become terrible. And they deserve to be kicked out. They're the 7 nations that get kicked out. So what we see in both cases are, Nephilim are people who start off good and end up bad. Really bad. And if you get involved with them, you end up dead. It ends up really bad for you. Okay? If you get involved with these Nephilim, it ends up bad. Okay. Now, say it one more time. Who? Well, Canaanite is a general term for all of the 7 nations that were there, right? If you there are actually 10. There are actually 10 nations. 3 of them we don't know the names, and there's a lot of Kabbalah that goes into that, like 7. Okay, and so forth. All right, now. When we learn this story about the Anakites, and Moses is telling them this story, if you look now on the back of the page, Deuteronomy chapter 7. So, let me just make sure I have this clear in my mind before I say, I don't want to say this the wrong way. It's a little tricky. Moses is going to die at 120. Okay. Now, one of the things that we saw at the end of Genesis chapter, at the end of the Torah portion of Bereshit, is that God said, from now on, you're not going to live these long periods of life. You're only going to live to 120. And here we see, and then after 120, it's like something bad happens. And Moses is going to live to 120, and then he's going to die, and the Jews are going to go into the land of Israel, and something bad's going to happen. Because they're going to go there, and they're going to get kicked out, and they're going to go away from Torah. And according to the Midrash, when Noah was building the ark, it took him 120 years to build it. Why? Because he was warning the people that people would walk by and say, why are you building this thing for so long? He says, because if you don't repent, God's going to destroy you. But I'm going to, I have, I have VIP cabin, and, I have the drink package, and, I have free Wi-Fi, I have all these things, and you guys, you're not going to have that. Right? And you're all going to die. So that's 120 years. And then something bad happens. And then Moses lives another 120 years, and something bad happens. And so this is foreshadowing. This, you're only going to live for 120 years, is that I give you these warning periods of 120 years, and then something bad is going to happen. But so think about now, every time you get involved with the Nephilim, something bad happens. Okay? And Moses is now telling these stories. But in order to make this make sense, I have to show you a couple verses in Deuteronomy. Let me ask you a question first, though. Does anyone know, according to the tradition, according to Torah, when did Moses actually write down the entire Torah? At what point in the Torah did he write down the whole Torah? The answer is not Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, he wrote down the mitzvahs and got all the information about the mitzvahs in the oral law. But he didn't write down the whole Torah. How do I know that? Because you don't have to, well, let's see if I have the verse here. I can prove it. Because it says in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses began to explain this Torah, saying. So, in other words, it's like he finished the Torah and then he began to explain it. And the Talmud says there, Moses wrote this book there in the plains of Moab. But it also says, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 24 to 26. It says, and it came to pass, listen closely, this is Deuteronomy 31, 24. And it came to pass, when Moses had finished writing the words of this Torah in a book until they were completed, that at this point he commanded the Levites. Well, where's that? 31:24. And so the understanding is that he wrote down all the mitzvahs on Mount Sinai and all the explanations he got orally from God that became later the oral Torah. But over the course of the 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness, God was dictating to Moses how to write the Torah. But he didn't finish writing the whole thing and really writing it all out until they get to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is when they're in the plains of Moab, which means if you ever go to the Dead Sea, you know the Dead Sea, the other side's Jordan, that's the plains of Moab. The other side of the Dead Sea, Jordan, Moab. Maybe a little south of there. I guess that part's Edom, but if you go a little south of the Dead Sea, it's Moab, in the land of the Moabites. It's where Job's from. Okay, it's where Ruth is from. So that's where he's writing the Torah. So now, if you look now, just one last source, the last source on the sheet that I brought is Deuteronomy chapter 7. Look what God says. When God brings you to the land that you are to enter and possess, and God dislodges many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations much larger than you, and God delivers them to you and you defeat them. You must doom them to destruction, grant them no terms, and give them no quarter. Okay, which means to say, what's Moses most afraid of? Assimilation. That you're going to assimilate with these other people. And who are these other people? These are the Anakites. These are the Anakites that you were afraid of, that you saw, who you sometimes refer to as Nephilim. And so what's happening here is the story of Nephilim is meant to show us in Genesis what happens when people who aren't supposed to mix together mix together. It ended up in a flood. And then we find out that the people living in Israel before the Jews get there are also Nephilim. And right before they get there, this is Deuteronomy, right before they're about to go into the land of Israel, Moses reminds them, don't mix with those Nephilim who are there. Because if you do, it'll be 120 years and then you'll have your flood and you'll be kicked out. And so the whole point of this story The whole point of the Nephilim in Genesis is to get us ready for there are going to be other places that Jews are going to come into contact with people you're not supposed to mix with. And if you take their customs and their traditions, then it's going to take you away from Torah and the whole thing's going to fall apart. So the main point here, the main story is that before Moses brought this back to remind them. So, and he references the Nephilim. And he says, you know who I'm afraid you're going to get involved with? The people who terrified you with the spies. And when you get involved with those kinds of people, really, really bad things happen. So the whole point of the story at the end of Genesis was to set up. Now, I don't know if you heard my sermon on Yom Kippur about peoplehood. I didn't want to say I told you so. But I told you so. So let me just end with the story. I was meeting with a woman this week, member of our congregation, who used to teach in a Christian school here in Miami. She was a teacher there. For many years, beloved teacher. She loved it there. She retired. It's great. And she taught little kids, first, second graders. And she was the Jewish teacher there. You know, this is 30, 40 years ago. And the kids loved her. But every once in a while, a first grader would come up to her and say, I don't understand. What don't you understand? What do you mean you don't believe in Jesus? I don't get it. What do you mean? Like, how could that be? So she explained to them, I'm different. But different is good. Right? And so often we define different as bad. And I think it's important for a Jew to be able to say to non-Jews, yeah, we're different. We are different. Isn't that wonderful? And you're different. You do worship Jesus or Allah or, whoever. And that's great. We can still be friends, but we're different. And there's certain things that we should do differently. Right? There's certain times a year we don't eat bread. And you do. And that's fine. There's certain times of days a year we don't eat at all. And you do. And there's certain times a year that you collect Easter eggs. And we don't. I love the Cadbury. I'm okay with that. I love those, especially the chocolate with the white creamy filling. I love those. But there's actually an entire tractate in the Talmud called Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah means foreign worship. And one of the things it says is you're not allowed to give gifts to no, we don't do this anymore. But you're not supposed to give gifts to non-Jews before their holidays. Because let's say you gave money or food to a non-Jew before their holidays. In the Talmud, it's called Lifnei Idam, Idam with an aleph. And then they use that food for their celebration of an idol. Then that becomes idol worship. Now today, when our friends primarily are also monotheists, you don't have that problem. If you gave a friend a cake and they used it for their Christmas celebration, we don't consider that a problem because we consider it monotheist. And even though you have some issues with the Trinity, Judaism generally recognizes Christianity as a monotheistic religion, so you don't have that problem. But in ancient times, you had to be very careful about what people did with idolatry. And the point of that is we respect their traditions. They respect our traditions, God willing. But we have our traditions. And I think what the Torah is saying is, if you don't preserve them as Jewish, you lose them. And when you lose them, there's a flood. Or when you lose them, you lose your land. Now, we in America, and this pretty much was my Yom Kippur sermon in a nutshell, but we in America have to navigate this path because a lot of our friends are not Jewish. A lot of our family members are not Jewish. My in-laws are not Jewish. And I had to raise my kids taking them to Christmas in December in Ohio. So I told them it's not bad to be Christian. It's bad to live in Ohio. That's, I mean, the weather is, I mean, it's, but we did it. We go every year for Christmas to my in-laws, and we wrap our kids' presents in blue and white. And when Hanukkah happens to coincide with Christmas, we bring our menorahs. When Hanukkah doesn't coincide with Christmas, we don't bring our menorahs because you don't light menorahs on days that aren't Hanukkah. And we go and we celebrate with them what they're doing. But that's not what we do. And that's okay. But this was Moses' greatest fear. And what I want to point out here, last point, is that the purpose of sending this message right before they go into the land of Israel, if you put it all together like this, and you say Moses was telling them about the Anakites right before they went into the land of Israel, because he said every time you look back at something that happens with the Anakites, it turns out terribly, then your JEPD stuff doesn't work as well. Right? The idea that different people wrote the Torah at different times doesn't work as well, because it suggests evidence that all of the different books of the Torah were written in ways that they had to be written in that way as one, from one mind, from one mindset. And if you take different parts and put them together, then these things kind of fall apart and you miss the actual point of what the Torah was trying to represent. Now, you might say, yeah, but what, okay, I'm not saying JEPD is wrong, but I'm just saying this might be some evidence you would look and say, I don't know. That doesn't, whatever you want to believe is what you want to believe. Makes no difference to me. But it's just some evidence you might look at and say, wow, the whole Torah really works together as one. And if you don't understand the point of the Nephilim in the other places of the Torah, how can you understand it at the end of Deuteronomy when Moses is telling the people, don't become the Anakites right before you're about to move in and live with the Anakites, which was his greatest fear. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.